I am not sitting next to that woman. Move her or move me, but I will not spend 7 hours breathing the same air. The words sliced through the first-class cabin of Atlantic Crown Airways Flight 714 like a blade drawn across silk. They were loud enough to reach every leather seat, every polished tray table, every set of noise-canceling headphones that hadn't yet been switched on. They carried the kind of venom that doesn't need volume. It was already soaked into every syllable. The speaker was a woman standing in the aisle of row 2, her Louis Vuitton carry-all dangling from one arm like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to swing. Her face was pinched into a mask of theatrical disgust, her chin lifted at an angle that suggested the world owed her something and had failed to deliver. In exactly 22 minutes, this woman's words would cost her husband's company a $40 million deal, erase her name from every board she sat on, and cancel a flight carrying 312 people across the Atlantic Ocean. But right now, standing in the aisle of an Airbus A350 at Gate 34 of John F. Kennedy International Airport, Caroline Davenport believed she was winning. Before we get into the full story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. And if this story moves you even a little, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Now let's step back inside that first-class cabin. The evening was August 14th. The time was 8:47 p.m. Eastern. Outside the aircraft, JFK was its usual organized chaos of taxiing planes, flashing runway lights, and the distant roar of engines spooling up for departure. But inside the first-class cabin of Flight 714, the world was supposed to be different. This was the bubble, the sanctuary. 8 seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each one a private cocoon of hand-stitched leather, adjustable mood lighting, and the faint scent of sandalwood diffused through the overhead vents. The gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit created a low, steady vibration beneath the floor. Flight attendants moved between rows with practiced grace, offering flutes of pre-departure champagne and warm towels that smelled of eucalyptus. A soft jazz playlist murmured through the cabin speakers just loud enough to smooth the edges of conversation without competing with it. Everything was designed to whisper a single message to the passengers who had paid $12,000 for a seat. You are important. You belong here. The world outside cannot touch you. Dr. Naomi Blackwell, seated in 2J, a window seat on the starboard side, had barely noticed any of it. She was engrossed in a set of quarterly projection reports displayed on her tablet, the columns of numbers as familiar and comforting to her as sheet music to a concert pianist. Her index finger scrolled slowly, pausing occasionally to highlight a figure or tap a note into the margin. Her brow was smooth, her breathing was even. She was, by every outward measure, a woman entirely at peace. At 48 years old, Naomi Blackwell carried an aura of quiet authority that needed no announcement, no nameplate, no entourage. It simply existed in the way she sat, the way she held her shoulders, the way her eyes moved across a page with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent decades turning complexity into clarity. Her charcoal gray suit was tailored by a Savile Row artisan she had known for 12 years, the fabric cut close enough to suggest elegance without demanding attention. Her salt and pepper hair was styled in a chic, short afro that framed her face with an effortless sophistication. The only jewelry she wore was a watch, a Patek Philippe Calatrava with a midnight blue dial, a gift she had bought herself the day Prism Forge Technologies, the company she had built from a one-bedroom apartment in East Oakland, first crossed a $1 billion valuation. She was the founder and chief executive officer of Prism Forge, a cybersecurity and data encryption empire now valued at $4.2 billion. Her algorithms protected the financial data of 200 million people across 6 continents. Her clients included central banks, defense ministries, and 3 of the 5 largest payment processors on Earth. Power for Naomi Blackwell was not loud. It was the silent, irrefutable logic of a perfectly executed line of code. It was the knowledge that the digital walls keeping the world's money safe had been built by her hands. But none of that was visible right now. Right now, she was just a black woman in a gray suit reading on a tablet. And to Caroline Davenport, That was all she would ever be. The boarding process had been nearing its end when the calm was first punctured. Caroline had appeared at the entrance to row 2, like a storm front rolling in from the horizon, slow but unmistakable. She was 57 years old, though she would never admit to more than 49. Her blonde hair was a rigid helmet of hairspray that hadn't moved since she left her stylist's chair in Greenwich, Connecticut at 2 that afternoon. Her makeup was thick, layered with the meticulous excess of a woman who believed that more was always more. Her cream-colored cashmere wrap probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her eyes, cold and pale blue, scanned the cabin not with curiosity, but with appraisal, the way a hotel inspector checks a room for deficiencies. Behind her, her husband Mark hovered like a shadow that had learned to apologize for existing. He was 59, tall and thin, with thinning gray hair, and the kind of face that had been handsome once, but had since been worn smooth by decades of acquiescence. He carried both their carry-on bags, struggling slightly under the weight, while Caroline carried nothing but her designer handbag and her sense of entitlement. "Here we are, dear Mark," murmured, gesturing toward the aisle seat, 2H, next to Naomi's window seat. His voice was gentle, almost pleading. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years navigating his wife's moods like a sailor reading storm clouds. Caroline didn't sit down. She stood in the aisle, her eyes traveling from the seat number printed above the headrest to the woman seated by the window. The appraisal was swift. It was dismissive, and it was deeply, unmistakably insulting. Her gaze moved from Naomi's face to her suit, to her hands, to her watch, and then back to her face. And in that single sweep, she had rendered her verdict. Naomi, feeling the weight of the stare the way you feel someone standing too close in a quiet room, slowly looked up from her tablet. Her expression was neutral, the way a lake is neutral before a stone breaks its surface. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked, her voice calm and even, carrying the kind of composure that most people only achieve when they've rehearsed a line. She hadn't rehearsed anything. She had simply lived this moment before, in different cabins, different rooms, different cities, enough times to have built an instinct for it. Caroline ignored her. She turned instead to the flight attendant who had been hovering nearby with a patient, practiced smile. Sarah Jennings was 28 years old, with auburn hair pulled into a neat bun, and the kind of face that was built for customer service, open, agreeable, eager to help. She had been with Atlantic Crown for 3 years. She had handled turbulence, medical emergencies, and the occasional belligerent drunk in economy. But the look on Caroline Davenport's face was something her training manual had no chapter for. "Excuse me, Caroline," said, her voice carrying a sharp nasal tone that sliced through the cabin's soft murmur like a fork scraping porcelain. "There must be a mistake. This is my seat, but I can't possibly sit here." Sarah's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Mrs. Davenport, yes, 2H is right here. Is there something wrong with the seat itself?" "The seat is fine," Caroline snapped, gesturing vaguely toward Naomi without making eye contact with her. The gesture was loose, dismissive, the kind of wave you'd use to indicate a stain on a tablecloth. "The arrangement is the problem. I paid a significant amount of money for this ticket. I have certain expectations about my travel experience. I am not sitting next to her for 7 hours. The word "her" was left hanging in the conditioned air, weighted with a toxic significance that was instantly understood by every person within earshot. It wasn't the word itself. It was the way she said it. The curl of her lip, the slight backward lean of her body as if proximity itself was contamination. The refusal to look at Naomi, to acknowledge her as a person rather than an obstruction. A hush fell over the front of the cabin like a curtain dropping. The man in 3J, a young guy in a casual blazer with dark curly hair, slowly lowered the magazine he'd been flipping through. The elderly couple in row 1 paused their quiet conversation, the woman's hand freezing on her husband's arm. A businessman across the aisle set down his champagne glass and stared. Naomi felt it. Not the stare, she was used to stares. What she felt was a familiar, weary ache that settled deep in her bones, in the place where exhaustion lives when it's been accumulating for 40 years. It was the tiredness of 1,000 tiny cuts, a lifetime of navigating spaces where her presence was questioned, her competence doubted, her success treated as an anomaly that needed to be explained rather than simply accepted. She had chaired board meetings with dismissive old guard patriarchs who wouldn't look her in the eye. She had negotiated hostile takeovers with Wall Street veterans who assumed she was someone's assistant. She had stared down government regulators in classified briefings and never blinked. Yet here, in the manufactured civility of a first-class cabin surrounded by champagne and warm towels and the gentle hum of a $70 million aircraft, she was reduced to an arrangement, a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be relocated. Sarah Jennings was clearly flustered. Her training covered unruly passengers' medical emergencies, security threats, and the occasional celebrity who needed extra privacy. It had no protocol for this quiet, suffocating bigotry delivered in the language of customer complaints, the kind that hides behind words like expectations and preferences while meaning something far uglier. Ma'am Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it professional. All of our first-class seats are currently occupied. This is your assigned seat based on your booking. Then unassign it? Caroline demanded, her voice rising half an octave. Several more heads turned. Find me another one. Or move her. She finally looked at Naomi, and the look was not confusion or discomfort. It was a sneer. Perhaps she'd be more comfortable in the back of the plane. The phrase landed in the cabin like a lit match dropped onto gasoline. In the back of the plane. The words carried centuries of weight, echoes of buses and lunch counters and water fountains, and all the quiet, brutal architecture of separation that had been built and rebuilt, and disguised and renamed, but never fully dismantled. Mark Davenport shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his face turning a blotchy, mottled red. Caroline, please, just sit down, he whispered urgently, tugging at the sleeve of her cashmere wrap. You're making a scene. She shook him off with a violent jerk of her arm. Don't you Caroline me, Mark. You know I have that critical meeting with the Pemberton Group first thing in the morning. I need to rest properly. I will not be made uncomfortable. In seat 3J, the young man with the dark, curly hair made a decision. His name was Jack Medina. He was 34 years old, a freelance documentary filmmaker based in Brooklyn, who had spent the last 6 years making films about the stories people tried to keep quiet. He had covered immigration raids in Texas, water contamination in rural Appalachia, and housing discrimination in South Boston. He knew the sound of injustice. He'd trained his ear for it the way a musician trains for pitch, and he had just heard it clear as a bell in the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight. Without a word, Jack tilted his phone just slightly, positioning it against the seatback pocket so the camera lens faced the aisle. He pressed record. His face remained neutral, almost bored. But the red recording light hidden behind his fingers was steady. He didn't know who the woman in 2J was. He didn't know who Caroline Davenport was. He didn't need to. He knew what he was seeing. And now his camera was seeing it too. In seat 1, a Harper Fontaine lowered her reading glasses to the tip of her nose and peered over them with the practiced evaluative gaze of someone who had spent 3 decades weighing evidence. She was 67 years old, a retired federal judge from Boston, who had presided over some of the most consequential civil rights cases in the First Circuit's history. Her silver hair was cropped short, her posture was immaculate, and her face betrayed nothing. But her eyes were doing what they had always done. They were watching, measuring, cataloging every word, every gesture, every silence that said as much as speech. Her husband Arthur, seated beside her, leaned in. "Harper," he murmured. "I see it," she replied quietly without looking at him. "I see all of it." In seat 1C, a different kind of watching was happening. Vincent Greer, 61, silver-maned and broad-shouldered, adjusted his cufflinks with the deliberate care of a man who wanted the world to notice his accessories. He was a hedge fund manager, old guard Wall Street, the kind of man who believed that wealth was a form of natural selection, and that first-class cabins were the last bastion of meritocracy. He watched the scene with a faint smirk that he didn't bother to hide. To him, Caroline's objection was understandable. Perhaps not polite, but understandable. Naomi slowly placed her tablet on the small table beside her seat. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. At 5'9", her frame seemed to command the narrow aisle not with aggression, but with a stillness that was more unsettling than any raised fist. She was not angry. Anger was a hot, messy, reactive emotion. What she felt was something colder, sharper, the same precision she applied when she found a critical vulnerability in a line of code. She had identified the flaw. Now, she would address it. She looked directly at Sarah Jennings, not at Caroline, not at Mark, at the representative of the institution. The passenger in 2H has stated she will not sit next to me because of my race, Naomi said, her voice as level and clear as a newsreader's. She has also suggested I would be more comfortable in the back of the plane. I'd like to understand your airline's procedure for handling a passenger who is engaged in discriminatory conduct before takeoff. The clinical direct nature of the statement stunned the cabin into a deeper silence. Naomi hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pleaded or argued or matched Caroline's hostility with her own. She had stated facts and asked for protocol. She had taken the ugly emotional mess of what was happening and distilled it into a clean, unambiguous question that demanded a clean, unambiguous answer. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes darting between Naomi and Caroline and the galley curtain behind her, as if hoping someone more senior might materialize and take this off her hands. "Ma'am, I need to get the purser," she managed. "Yes," Naomi said, her gaze sweeping briefly over Caroline's indignant face and then to Mark's mortified one, before returning to Sarah with the patience of a woman who had all the time in the world. "I believe you do, because I want you to understand something clearly. This flight is not taking off until this is resolved. Not to your satisfaction, not to hers. To mine." She sat back down in 2J, picked up her tablet, and resumed reading her quarterly projections as if nothing had happened. As if the cabin around her hadn't just been cracked open like an egg, leaving a stunned, uncomfortable silence in her wake. Caroline stood in the aisle, arms crossed, chin lifted, certain that she had won the first round. After all, they were getting the purser. Surely someone with authority would see reason. She had no idea that the woman she had just refused to sit next to could end careers with a phone call, ground a fleet with a signature, and turn one act of prejudice into a corporate catastrophe that would be studied in business schools for decades. The bubble of first class had burst, and the air rushing in was about to change everything. The purser arrived with the measured calm of a man who had been putting out fires for 20 years and had learned that the most important thing was to never look like you were running. Darren Caldwell was 52 with a square jaw, thinning brown hair combed neatly to one side, and the kind of deep-set eyes that had seen turbulence of every variety, atmospheric and human. His uniform was pressed with military precision, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He carried himself with the authority of someone who believed that every problem had a procedural solution, and that the procedural solution was always the right one. Sarah met him at the galley curtain and delivered a rapid, whispered summary, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Darren listened with his head slightly tilted, his expression shifting from concern to calculation. His eyes flicked toward row 2, toward the standing Caroline and the seated Naomi, and in that glance he made his first assessment. Upset passenger, calm passenger. The upset one is the variable. Neutralize the variable. Get the plane off the ground. It was a reasonable instinct for a man whose career was measured in on-time departures. But tonight, that instinct was going to be his undoing. Mrs. Davenport Darren began positioning himself in the aisle with the practiced stance of a negotiator, feet slightly apart, hands clasped in front of him. His voice was a smooth baritone, the kind that was engineered to calm. "Good evening. I'm Darren Caldwell, the flight's purser. I understand there's been some concern regarding your seating arrangement." Concern Caroline scoffed, her arms still crossed, her chin still elevated to that imperious angle. "It's not a concern. It's unacceptable. I've been a Diamond Medallion member with this airline for 16 years. I've flown over 1 million miles. I have certain expectations about my travel experience, and this is not what I paid for." "I understand," Darren said, nodding slowly, his voice dripping with the rehearsed empathy of 1,000 customer interactions. "And may I ask specifically what about the seating is causing discomfort?" It was a question he already knew the answer to. Everyone in the cabin knew the answer. But protocol required him to hear it directly, to give her the rope. What he would do with that rope was another matter entirely. Caroline's eyes narrowed. She was shrewd enough to know the trap smart enough to step around the explicit words while leaving no doubt about their meaning. "I believe I've made myself perfectly clear," she said, her voice dropping to a register that she probably thought sounded dignified, but actually sounded like someone trying to return a meal at a restaurant without admitting they simply didn't like the waiter. I have my preferences. I expect a certain standard. I'm paying for a premium experience, and I'm telling you that this is not it. She refused to say the word. She buried the racism under the bland language of customer dissatisfaction, wrapping it in expectations and standards and preferences the way you'd wrap a brick in tissue paper. It was a coward's tactic, and every single person within earshot knew it. Naomi didn't look up from her tablet, but she spoke. Her voice cut through the pretense like a scalpel through gauze. She said, and I quote, "I am not sitting next to her." She then suggested I would be more comfortable in the back of the plane with her own kind. Please don't allow her to obscure the issue, Darren. The issue is that Mrs. Davenport objects to sitting next to a black woman. Let's not pretend otherwise. The word black landed in the quiet cabin with the weight of a gavel. It was one thing to imply the racism, to feel it humming beneath the surface like a current under ice. It was another thing entirely to name it, to drag it out into the open where it couldn't hide behind euphemisms, where it had to stand naked and be seen for exactly what it was. The polite deniability that Caroline had been so carefully constructing was stripped away in a single sentence. Mark Davenport winced visibly, his eyes closing as if he could make himself disappear. In seat 1, a Harper Fontaine set her reading glasses down on her armrest and folded her hands in her lap, the gesture of a woman who had just decided to pay very close attention. In 3J, Jack Medina's phone continued its silent recording. Darren's professional mask slipped for a fraction of a second, a twitch at the corner of his left eye before he reassembled it. He cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am," he said to Caroline, his tone hardening by one careful degree. "We take all allegations of discriminatory language very seriously. This is a significant matter." Allegations. Caroline shot back her face, flushing with the particular shade of crimson that comes from being cornered. "I'm the one being insulted here. She just called me a racist in front of the entire cabin. I want to speak to the captain immediately, and I want a different seat. Now." Darren paused. This was the moment of decision, the fork in the road that would define everything that followed. The airline's standard de-escalation protocol was clear, even if it was never written down in those exact words. When a passenger creates a disturbance before pushback, the priority is to neutralize the situation with minimal disruption to the departure schedule. Appeasement is efficiency. Move the pieces, smooth the surface, get the plane in the air, deal with the paperwork later. And so Darren turned, not to Caroline, to Naomi. This was his mistake. This was the crack in the foundation that would bring the entire structure down, and he didn't even realize he was making it. "Dr. Blackwell," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he leaned slightly closer, the way a hotel concierge might speak to a guest being relocated due to a noise complaint. "I want to sincerely apologize for this deeply uncomfortable situation. I can see how distressing this must be." He paused, arranging his features into what he believed was compassion. "We do have one other seat available in first class. 1K. It's a lovely single-window seat, very private. Perhaps, for your own comfort, you would be willing to relocate. We would, of course, offer a substantial travel credit for the inconvenience, $5,000, and a guaranteed upgrade on your next 3 flights with us." He delivered the offer with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was being generous, helpful even. In his mind, he was solving the problem elegantly. The upset passenger gets her way. The calm passenger gets compensated. The plane takes off. Everyone wins. But Naomi Blackwell finally put her tablet down. She set it on the armrest beside her with the deliberate care of someone placing down a weapon they won't be needing. She turned her head and looked at Darren Caldwell, and for the first time the composed neutrality in her eyes was replaced by something else. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too messy, too easy to dismiss. What flashed behind her gaze was colder than that. It was the glacial fire of a woman who had just watched an institution confirm exactly what she had always suspected about it. "Let me make sure I understand your proposal correctly," she said. Her voice was soft, dangerously soft. The kind of soft that makes people lean in, not because they can't hear, but because something in the tone tells them they need to hear every single word. This passenger has created a disturbance based on racial prejudice. She has insulted me, refused to sit beside me because of the color of my skin, suggested I belong in the back of the aircraft, and violated your airline's own carriage contract, as well as federal anti-discrimination law. She paused, letting each fact land like a stone dropped into still water. And your solution, she continued, is to reward her behavior by giving her exactly what she demanded, to give her the victory of an empty seat, and to inconvenience me, the target of her abuse, by asking me to uproot myself and relocate to a different seat. Another pause. The cabin was so silent that the hum of the auxiliary power unit sounded like a roar. You are asking me to consent to my own segregation, Darren, and you're offering me $5,000 to do it, as if dignity has a price point. Her eyes held his without blinking. The answer is no. The answer has always been no. The answer will always be no. Darren's face drained of color, as if someone had pulled a plug beneath his skin. The word segregation hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. It was only intended to resolve the situation. For your comfort, I was trying to— You were trying to protect your departure time, Naomi finished for him. You were trying to move the problem out of sight so you could close the cabin door and take off on schedule. And the problem in your assessment was not the woman spewing racial hostility in your aisle. The problem was me, my presence, my refusal to disappear quietly. That's what you were trying to solve. From seat 1A, a voice rose, clear, measured, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who was accustomed to being listened to. She's absolutely right. Every head turned. Harper Fontaine had not raised her voice. She didn't need to. At 67, retired from the federal bench after 3 decades of service, Harper had spent her career in rooms where words carried the weight of law. She knew how to fill a space with nothing more than diction and certainty. I spent 30 years on the federal bench, Harper said, adjusting her posture so that she faced Darren directly. I have presided over discrimination cases, housing cases, employment cases, and I have never in 3 decades witnessed a more textbook case of institutional accommodation of prejudice than what I just watched you do. She pointed at Darren, her finger steady as a compass needle. You asked the victim to move, not the aggressor, the victim. That is not de-escalation. That is endorsement. And if I were still on the bench, I would tell you that what you just proposed to this woman has significant legal exposure for your airline. The words landed like a ruling. Darren's mouth opened. No sound came out. From seat 1C, Vincent Greer shifted in his seat and let out a theatrical sigh. He was leaning back with his arms crossed, one ankle resting on the opposite knee, radiating the kind of relaxed confidence that only comes from decades of believing your opinion matters more than everyone else's. Oh, come on, he said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of a man who had never been inconvenienced by his own skin color. Let's not make this into a civil rights case. She was offered a better seat, a single window, $5,000. Take the upgrade and stop turning this into a federal issue. He looked at Caroline and gave a small nod, the kind of silent solidarity that said, I'm on your side. Then he looked at Naomi with an expression that was closer to pity than hostility, which somehow made it worse. Some of us have flights to catch. In seat 3H, Patricia Lowell, 44. A Connecticut socialite who ran in the same circles as Caroline, leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered just loud enough for the adjacent rows to hear. Some people just love playing the victim. Give them an inch, and they'll take the whole plane. She punctuated the remark with a small laugh, a breathy, dismissive sound that was designed to diminish. The kind of laugh that says, this isn't serious. This person isn't serious. But from 3, J. Jack Medina spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, almost casual, but his words had edges. Ma'am, he said, not looking up from his phone, which was still recording. Do you want to say that a little louder? My camera didn't quite catch it. Patricia's laugh died in her throat. She turned sharply to look at Jack. saw the phone angled toward the aisle and pressed her lips together into a thin, bloodless line. She didn't speak again. Behind the curtain that separated first class from business, a young woman was standing in the narrow passageway, one hand gripping the overhead compartment for balance, her body half hidden by the fabric divider. Sophia Reyes was 26 years old, a graduate student in social justice policy at Columbia, flying economy to London for a summer research fellowship. She had gotten up to use the restroom and had stopped dead when she heard Caroline's voice cut through the curtain. Now she stood frozen, listening to every word, her phone already in her hand. Her thumb hovered over Instagram. She pressed live. Her face appeared on screen, half lit by the cabin's dim lighting, her dark eyes wide with the intensity of someone who knows they are witnessing something that matters. "You guys," she whispered into the camera. "I'm on a flight at JFK right now. I'm standing right outside first class. A woman just told a black passenger to go sit with her own kind. The airline just asked the black woman to move. I'm not making this up. Watch." She turned the camera toward the curtain gap where fragments of the scene were visible. Darren's frozen posture, Caroline's defiant crossed arms, the back of Naomi's head still and composed. Viewer count, 342. Then 1,200. Then 4,800. The stream had been live for less than 90 seconds. Back in the cabin, the tension was building in layers like pressure in a sealed container. Darren had retreated a step, physically backing away from Naomi's response, as if her words had a gravitational force. He looked to Sarah for help, but Sarah's face offered nothing except the wide-eyed expression of someone who was watching their supervisor walk into a propeller. It was then that Todd Brennan appeared. He was 38, a junior flight attendant with 7 years of service, sandy-haired and eager-faced, the kind of employee who had learned that the fastest path to promotion was making your supervisor's problems disappear. He had been watching from the galley and had decided it was time to be helpful. He approached Darren and leaned in close, his voice a barely audible murmur. "Darren, listen. Why don't I just prep 1K? I'll move her things while she's distracted by the conversation. Frame it as a complimentary upgrade. She'll see the single seat, the extra privacy, and she'll take it. Problem solved. Plane takes off. Everyone's happy." He said it with the casual efficiency of someone suggesting a shortcut on a map. To him, it was logistics. Move the obstacle, clear the path. But Naomi's hearing was sharper than Todd had calculated. Or perhaps it was that she had spent a lifetime training herself to hear the things that were said in whispers, because whispers were where the real decisions were made. "If you touch my belongings," she said without turning her head, without raising her voice, without so much as glancing in Todd's direction, "I will consider it theft and act accordingly. I suggest you reconsider." Todd's face went white. He looked at Darren. Darren looked at the floor. Todd retreated to the galley and did not reappear. Caroline, who had been watching this exchange with growing impatience, seized on what she perceived as momentum. In her mind, the fact that the airline had offered Naomi a different seat meant that the airline agreed with her, that she was right, that the natural order of things was being restored, just slowly. "You see," she said, her voice swelling with the confidence of someone who doesn't realize they're standing on a trap door. "Even your own staff knows this is wrong. They were trying to resolve it. She's the one being difficult." She turned to look at Naomi directly, and for the first time she didn't look away. "You should take what they offered you. It's more than generous. In the back of the plane, you'd get nothing," Caroline Mark said through gritted teeth, his hand on her arm. "Stop. Please, stop." "Why should I stop? I'm stating facts. There are standards, there are expectations, and when those expectations aren't met, I have every right to speak up." She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and delivered her final assessment with the certainty of a woman who had never once been contradicted by reality. Perhaps she'd be more comfortable with her own kind. The second time she said it, the words hit differently. Not harder exactly, but deeper. Because repetition stripped away any possible ambiguity. There was no misinterpretation. No, maybe she meant something else. She meant exactly what everyone thought she meant, and she had now said it twice. Harper Fontaine's husband Arthur placed a hand on his wife's arm, the kind of gentle restraint that suggested he knew what was coming. Harper removed his hand, patted it once, and turned back to watch the scene with the focused intensity of a woman composing a ruling in her head. In 4B, Marco Delgado had been listening with his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his temples were visible. He was 29, compact and athletic with close-cropped dark hair and the posture of someone who had spent years in cockpits. He was an off-duty pilot for a competing airline deadheading on this flight to connect to a repositioning assignment in London. He knew aviation law the way most people know their own phone number, and what he had just heard, both from Caroline and from Darren, had set off every alarm in his professional conscience. But he waited. He was trained to wait. Pilots don't react to the first warning light. They assess, they verify, they act when the data is clear. The data was getting very clear. On Sophia Reyes's Instagram Live, the viewer count had climbed to 11,400. Comments were scrolling faster than she could read them. Oh my gosh, is this real? What airline is this? That woman needs to be removed. The airline asked her to move. The victim. Someone find out who that blonde woman is. Sophia's hands were trembling, but her phone was steady. She knew what she was watching. She had studied cases like this in her coursework, the way institutions, when confronted with individual bigotry, instinctively protect the aggressor by removing the target. She had written papers about it. Now, she was watching it happen in real time, 3 feet from where she stood. And 45,000 people were watching it with her. Back in the cabin, Darren Caldwell made one more attempt to regain control of the situation. He straightened his uniform jacket, cleared his throat, and addressed both women with the careful neutrality of a man reading from a script that was burning in his hands. Mrs. Davenport, Dr. Blackwell. I understand emotions are running high. I want to assure both of you that Atlantic Crown takes the comfort and dignity of all passengers very seriously. We are doing everything we can to resolve this situation in a manner that is fair to everyone. Fair to everyone, Naomi repeated, the faintest trace of something that might have been dark humor ghosting across her expression. Darren, let me explain what fair to everyone looks like from where I'm sitting. I purchased this seat. I boarded this aircraft. I sat down, opened my tablet, and began reading my quarterly reports. I did not speak to anyone. I did not inconvenience anyone. I did not raise my voice. I simply existed in the space I paid for. And for that, for existing, I was insulted, targeted, and then asked by your airline to move. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the register that boardroom rivals had learned to fear. Fair is not a negotiation between the person who was wronged and the person who wronged her. Fair is you doing your job, which right now means addressing the passenger who is causing the disturbance, not the one reading her tablet. The silence that followed was not empty. It was pressurized, thick with the accumulated weight of everything that had been said and everything that was about to be. And what was about to be said next would change the trajectory of everyone's evening. I want the captain, Caroline declared, her voice climbing toward shrill. I demand it. I have been a loyal customer for 16 years. I deserve to be heard by someone with actual authority. That's an excellent idea, Naomi said, nodding once. Please do get the captain. I would very much like to hear his position on whether Atlantic Crown Airways negotiates with passengers who engage in racial discrimination. I suspect it will be quite instructive. What would you do if you were sitting in that cabin right now? Would you speak up? Or would you look away? Think about that. Because the captain is about to walk in, and the decision he makes in the next 3 minutes will change everything. Let us know in the comments. Captain James Miller stepped out of the cockpit and into the first-class cabin at exactly 9:03 p.m., and the tension he walked into was a physical thing thick enough to have its own weather system. He was 56 years old, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been chiseled by 25 years of crosswinds and cockpit decisions. His white uniform shirt was crisp, his epaulettes gleaming, and his posture carried the unmistakable authority of a man who was accustomed to being the final word on everything that happened within the aluminum tube he commanded. He had landed planes in snowstorms over Reykjavik. He had navigated volcanic ash clouds across the North Atlantic. He had managed engine failures, medical emergencies, and once a passenger who tried to open the emergency exit at 37,000 feet. In every crisis, his response was the same: assess, decide, act. No wasted words, no wasted time. But when Darren pulled him aside and whispered the situation in rapid, clipped sentences, something shifted behind Miller's eyes. This was a form of turbulence he couldn't fly over. He couldn't adjust altitude. He couldn't change heading. The storm was inside the cabin, and it was human. He listened to Darren's summary without interrupting. His gaze swept the cabin, taking in the key positions like a chess player reading the board. Caroline Davenport standing in the aisle, arms crossed, chin elevated, radiating the toxic confidence of a woman who believed authority would bend to her will. Mark Davenport behind her, a wilted figure of embarrassment. Naomi Blackwell, in 2J seated, composed her tablet, resting beside her like a closed book. Harper Fontaine, in 1A, watching with judicial precision. Jack Medina's phone, in 3J, its lens a silent witness. Vincent Greer in 1C, smirking. The quiet crowd, the heavy air. Miller saw all of it in 3 seconds. He processed it in 2 more, and then he walked directly to row 2. Mrs. Davenport. He began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge of command. The kind of voice that had talked air traffic controllers through emergency landings. I'm Captain James Miller, and I am responsible for the safety and operation of this aircraft. I've been briefed on the situation. Finally, Caroline said the word, dripping with the satisfaction of someone who believed the adults had arrived. Someone with authority. Captain, I have been treated abysmally by your staff. I am a Diamond Medallion member with over 1 million miles flown, and I have been subjected to insults and indignity from the moment I boarded. You were asked to take your seat, the captain stated flatly, his expression as readable as a concrete wall. That is standard procedure for any passenger. The issue, Caroline pressed her voice, hardening, as I have explained multiple times, is my seating assignment. I have my preferences, I have standards, and I expect those to be respected. Miller was not interested in games. His patience, vast as it was, had specific boundaries, and those boundaries were defined by one question and one question only. Can this plane take off safely and on time? Ma'am, he said, his voice shedding any remaining pretense of warmth. Let me be perfectly clear because I will only say this once. This aircraft is a common carrier operating under federal law. We do not discriminate, and we do not permit our passengers to impose discriminatory conditions on their fellow travelers. Your preference, as you call it, is not a valid basis for refusing your assigned seat or demanding that another passenger be relocated. He paused, not for dramatic effect, for clarity. You have 2 options. Option 1, you take your assigned seat, 2H, immediately, and conduct yourself with the civility that we expect of all passengers for the duration of this flight. Option 2, you deplane. We will remove your luggage from the cargo hold, and you may make alternative travel arrangements. He clasped his hands behind his back. We will not be debating this. The finality in his voice was absolute. It was the vocal equivalent of a steel door closing. This was not the negotiation Caroline had expected. She had expected what she always got when she deployed the words Diamond Medallion and loyalty and standards. She expected accommodation. She expected someone to say, "Of course, Mrs. Davenport, let us make this right for you." Instead, she had been given an ultimatum by a man whose face made it clear that he would carry it out without hesitation. Her expression, that mask of righteous indignation she had been wearing like armor, began to crack. Not break, not yet, but crack the way ice cracks before it gives way. Deplane, she repeated the word, seeming to physically hurt her. You cannot be serious. I have a multi-million-pound deal to close in London tomorrow morning. My husband's company has an exclusive corporate account with this airline. Do you have any idea who we are? She played the card, the corporate account card, the "Do you know who I am" card. She played it with the absolute certainty of a woman who had never had it declined. Naomi, who had been watching this exchange with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment, felt a sudden sharp pang of irony. A corporate account. Caroline was trying to leverage a minnow against a whale, completely unaware of the ecosystem she was swimming in. Your business in London is your concern, not mine, Captain Miller said, his patience now visibly fraying at the edges, like a rope under too much strain. My concern is the safety and security of this flight, and every soul on board. A passenger creating a disturbance before we have even pushed back from the gate is a security concern. It disrupts the cabin environment, delays the aircraft, and creates a hostile atmosphere for other passengers. He looked at her the way he would look at a warning light on his instrument panel, with professional concern and zero sentimentality. "I will ask you one final time. Are you going to take your seat?" Caroline stared at him. Her mind was racing behind those cold blue eyes. The public humiliation, the defiance of her will, the sheer injustice of it all in her warped worldview was simply too much. She was Caroline Davenport. She was old money, old connections, old power. She had chaired charity galas, hosted senators at dinner parties, and once made a hotel manager in Monaco cry. She did not back down. She did not capitulate. And she certainly did not allow herself to be outmaneuvered by a flight attendant in a polyester tie and a pilot who probably grew up in some middle-class suburb in Ohio. Her pride, brittle and oversized and polished to a lethal shine, would not allow her to sit down. "This is outrageous," she hissed, the words escaping through clenched teeth. "I will be filing a formal complaint with your corporate office. I will be contacting my attorney. And you will be hearing from Davenport and Associates directly. This airline has not heard the last of this." Captain Miller nodded once. "Not at Caroline, at Darren. Inform the ground crew we have a passenger deplaning," he said, his voice as flat and procedural as if he were reporting a minor maintenance issue. Then he turned to address the cabin, his tone shifting to the practiced cadence of routine communication. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We have a minor situation to resolve, and we will be on our way shortly." It should have ended there. By every rule of airline logic, it was over. The problem passenger would be escorted off the aircraft. The flight would depart 20 minutes late. The incident would become a line item in a post-flight report filed alongside turbulence notes and catering discrepancies, and forgotten by the following Tuesday. But as Darren and Sarah moved to escort a sputtering Caroline and a mortified Mark from the plane, a voice rose from seat 2J. It was calm. It was precise. And it changed everything. Captain Miller. Miller turned surprised. He had assumed the resolution was complete. The offending party was being removed. The wronged party was being left in peace. Case closed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Naomi looked at him with an expression that held no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction. It held something far more dangerous. Clarity. "Removing her is a solution to your problem," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin with the clarity of a tuning fork. "It allows your flight to depart on schedule. It allows you to file an incident report and close the case. But it does not solve my problem." Miller looked confused. A wrinkle appeared between his brows that hadn't been there before. "Ma'am, the situation has been handled. You will not be disturbed further." Naomi continued as if explaining a complex theorem to a student who was bright enough to follow, but hadn't yet connected the dots. "My problem, Captain, is not one unruly passenger. My problem is what your airline's response to that passenger revealed. I am a client of Atlantic Crown. In fact, I am one of your airline's largest corporate clients in North America. My company, Prism Forge Technologies, spends $28 million a year on air travel with your airline. $28 million. Every quarter, every route, every executive trip." She let the number land. 28 million. She saw Miller's jaw tighten, saw the recognition spark behind his eyes. Prism Forge Technologies was a name that appeared in corporate briefings, in quarterly revenue reports, in the Tier 1 client list that executives guarded like state secrets. And as your client, Naomi, continued, her voice gaining a weight that had nothing to do with volume, "I was just subjected to racial harassment in your cabin. Your staff's first instinct was to ask me, the victim, to move to accommodate the bigotry. Your purser's de-escalation protocol was in practice to facilitate segregation. Only when I refused to be segregated did you escalate to removing the offending party. And even then you addressed it as a minor situation in your announcement, as if a passenger telling a black woman to go sit in the back of the plane is a minor situation." She held up her phone. The screen glowed in the dimmed cabin light. "So while I appreciate you removing Mrs. Davenport, the larger issue remains. Your airline's default response to prejudice is to accommodate it. And as a black woman and as a CEO who is responsible for the safety and well-being of hundreds of my employees who fly with your airline every single week, I find that unacceptable. Her thumb hovered over a contact on her screen. The name was visible to anyone close enough to read it. Liam, Travel and Logistics. She looked Captain Miller in the eye, not with hostility, with something worse. Certainty. My company has a morals and ethics clause embedded in every contract we sign with our vendors and service providers. What I have experienced today is a direct violation of that clause. So you see, Captain, you haven't solved my problem at all. You've just shown me how big it is. She pressed call. Liam, she said into the phone, her voice as clear and steady as a bell in a silent cathedral. It's Naomi. I'm on AC 714 at JFK. I'm invoking the ethics clause. Pull the Prism Forge account from Atlantic Crown, all of it. Every route, every booking, every executive ticket. Effective immediately. And rebook me to London on whatever competitor has availability tonight. I don't care about the cost. A pause. She listened to the frantic voice on the other end, with the patience of a surgeon listening to a nurse recite vitals. Yes, Liam, I am sure. This partnership is terminated. She hung up. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something heavier. It was 312 minds simultaneously processing what had just happened. $28 million. A Tier 1 corporate account. Gone. Not in a boardroom negotiation, not in a contract dispute, not over pricing or service quality or route availability. Gone because one woman refused to sit next to a black woman, and an airline's first response was to ask the black woman to move. Captain Miller stared at Naomi. His face had gone the color of old paper. His airline-issued phone, holstered on his belt, began to vibrate. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who was calling. It wasn't going to be the gate agent asking about pushback time. It was going to be someone whose title contained the words Vice President and whose voice was going to contain the sound of a career entering freefall. In seat 1A, Harper Fontaine looked at her husband. Well, she murmured, that's not something you see every day. Arthur shook his head slowly. That woman just did in 60 seconds what most discrimination lawsuits take 3 years to accomplish. In 3J, Jack Medina exhaled through his nose and whispered to his camera. You watching this? She just pulled $28 million from the airline with one phone call. One call. Remember this moment. And in the narrow passageway between first class and business, Sophia Reyes's Instagram Live had reached 112,000 viewers. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The comments were saying everything. She is a queen. 28 million gone. That's what power looks like. The airline tried to move her, and she moved them. But there was another layer to this story that no one in the cabin knew about yet. A layer that had been operating in silence since the first ugly words left Caroline Davenport's mouth. In seat 8D of business class, behind the curtain, behind the galley, behind the wall of separation between the premium passengers and the merely expensive ones, a woman had been watching. Claudia Moran was 40 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a low chignon, and the kind of calm, watchful face that most people underestimated exactly once. She was Prism Forge's general counsel, their top attorney, and she was on this flight because she was traveling to the same London meetings as Naomi on a separate booking, as was standard protocol for executive travel. You never put your CEO and your general counsel on the same reservation. Basic corporate risk management. Claudia had noticed the commotion the moment Caroline's voice pierced the curtain. She had quietly stood moved to a position where she could see through the gap in the fabric divider and begun documenting. Not with a live stream, not with drama, with timestamps, direct quotes, and the cold, methodical precision of a woman who had spent 15 years building litigation files that never lost. 6 minutes before Naomi made her call to Liam, Claudia had already sent an encrypted text to Devon Archer, Prism Forge's director of communications, sitting in his apartment in Brooklyn. Her message read, Ethics breach on our flight. Naomi is the target. Staff asked her to move to accommodate a racist passenger. Activate crisis protocol. Stand by for statement. Devon's reply came in 40 seconds. Draft statement ready. Legal flagged. Media monitoring active. Crisis team on standby. Standing by for authorization. The machine had been running before Naomi's call. Her network didn't wait for instructions. It anticipated. It prepared. It moved in parallel the way a well-built system is supposed to. And now, Captain Miller's phone was buzzing again. He stepped into the galley, pressed it to his ear, and heard a voice he recognized immediately. Henderson, Director of Operations, Atlanta. Miller Henderson barked his normally laconic southern drawl, now a high-pitched squawk of barely contained panic. What in the absolute hell is happening on your aircraft? I just got a call from the corporate sales division that made my blood pressure spike 40 points. Prism Forge Technologies just pulled their account. The entire account. $28 million a year. Their guy, Liam something, said it was due to, and I quote, a catastrophic ethics violation on your flight. Talk to me. Now. Miller stood in the narrow galley, his back pressed against the stainless steel counter, and explained the situation in clipped professional sentences. The refusal to sit, the racial undertones, the purser's attempt to move Dr. Blackwell, her refusal, his decision to deplane the Davenports, and then the call. There was a long silence on the line, the kind of silence that sounds like a career being re-evaluated. Captain Henderson said finally, his voice strained. The Davenports are off the plane, correct? They are being escorted to the Customer Resolution Office now, and Dr. Blackwell is still on board. She is. Another silence, shorter this time, more decisive. Hold the aircraft at the gate. Do not push back. Do not make any further announcements. A senior vice president of customer experience, George Whitfield, is being dispatched to the aircraft. He will be there in 5 minutes. Your new priority, Captain, is not flying this plane to London. Henderson paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who knew exactly how far the dominoes were going to fall. Your priority is keeping Dr. Naomi Blackwell from walking off that aircraft. Do I make myself clear? Miller hung up. A cold dread was seeping into his stomach, spreading outward like ice water through his veins. He was no longer a pilot in command of a transatlantic flight. He was the custodian of a corporate crisis that was growing by the second, and the woman at its center was sitting 15 feet away, calmly browsing the in-flight entertainment menu on the screen in front of her, as if deciding which movie to watch on a flight she had no intention of taking. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She was demonstrating with every casual gesture, with every moment of unhurried composure, that the chaos unfolding around her was the airline's problem, not hers. As the cabin held its breath as the airline's corporate machinery lurched into emergency mode, as 312 passengers sat in their seats, wondering why the plane wasn't moving, Naomi Blackwell sat perfectly still in 2J and looked out the window at the dark tarmac of JFK. To everyone watching, she looked untouchable, impervious, a woman carved from something harder than the situation around her. But inside, behind the armor, she had spent 40 years forging a door was opening. A door she kept locked. A door that led to a room she rarely visited, because visiting it meant remembering what it had cost to become the woman who could sit this still while the world burned around her. She had been here before, not in first class, not at 48 with a $4 billion company behind her name and a phone call that could reshape an airline's fiscal year. But in this exact moment, the moment when someone looked at her and saw nothing worth respecting. The first time was in Oakland. She was 9 years old. Her elementary school was a squat brick building on a street where the sidewalks had more cracks than concrete. Her teacher, Mrs. Hartwell, was a round-faced woman with a permanent smile and pastel cardigans, who smelled like vanilla extract and spoke to her students with the gentle condescension of someone who had already decided what their ceilings looked like. Parent-teacher conferences were held in the cafeteria at folding tables that wobbled on the uneven linoleum. Naomi's mother, Diane Blackwell, had come straight from her second job, still wearing the navy blue polo from the hospital laundry where she worked afternoons after her morning shift at the post office. Her hands were raw from industrial detergent. Her eyes were tired. But she sat at that wobbly table with her spine straight because she believed that how you carried yourself was a form of speech, and she always had something to say. Mrs. Hartwell spread Naomi's test scores across the table like a card dealer displaying a hand. Math, 98. Reading, 99. Science, 100. Perfect scores. Mrs. Hartwell smiled. Naomi is a lovely girl, she began the way people begin sentences when the word but is already loaded in the chamber. Very bright, very determined. She said determined the way some people say aggressive. But I think we need to be realistic about her trajectory. Not every student is built for the academic track, and there are wonderful vocational programs that could give Naomi practical skills for her future. Realistic goals, you know. Naomi, sitting in the plastic chair beside her mother, didn't fully understand the word trajectory. But she understood realistic. She understood it from the way Mrs. Hartwell's eyes slid away when she said it, the way her smile tightened, the way her fingers tapped the perfect test scores as if they were some kind of clerical error. Her mother's hand, still rough from the detergent, found Naomi's under the table and squeezed. She didn't squeeze hard, she squeezed once, meaning, "Hold on, I've got this." Mrs. Hartwell, Diane said, her voice as level as her daughter's would one day become. "My daughter scored higher than every child in this school. Every single one. And you want to talk to me about vocational programs?" She stood up, gathered the test papers, and folded them neatly into her purse. "Naomi will be applying to every advanced program this district offers. If you'd like to help with that, we'd appreciate it. If not, we'll find someone who will." That night in their cramped apartment, with the sound of traffic bleeding through the thin walls and the flicker of the kitchen's one working fluorescent light casting everything in a blue-white glow, Diane Blackwell pressed a library book into her daughter's hands. It was a biography of Mae Jemison, the first black woman in space. "Baby," she said, kneeling down to meet Naomi's eyes. "Realistic is their word for small. Don't you ever let someone else draw your ceiling. You draw your own. And you draw it so high they need a telescope to see it." Naomi had carried that sentence like a compass ever since. It had pointed her through every classroom, every rejection letter, every conference room where she was the only person who looked like her. It pointed her now at 48, sitting in first class on a grounded plane, her face betraying nothing, while her mother's voice echoed somewhere deep inside her chest. The second time she was in this moment, she was 22. The setting was different. The feeling was exactly the same. It was her first tech conference. She had graduated top of her class from UC Berkeley with a double major in computer science and applied mathematics, and she had scraped together enough money from her entry-level programming job to buy a coach ticket to a cybersecurity summit in Dallas. Middle seat, row 31, between a window occupied by a man who fell asleep before takeoff and an aisle occupied by another man who did not. His name didn't matter. What mattered was his voice loud and bourbon-glazed, speaking to his friend across the aisle, as if the 3-hour flight was his personal podcast studio. "The thing about these diversity hires," he said, leaning back with the comfort of a man who had never had to earn his seat, "is that they lower the bar for everyone. Companies don't care about merit anymore. They care about optics. They fill the seats with people who check boxes, and the rest of us have to carry the weight." His friend nodded. "Standards are gone, man. Used to be you had to prove yourself. Now you just have to be the right color." They laughed. A shared, knowing laugh that was louder than it needed to be, designed not just for each other, but for anyone within earshot who might agree, or who might not agree but would stay silent. And silence in that context was agreement enough. Naomi sat between them. 22 years old, 118 pounds, a borrowed laptop in her backpack, and a mind that could solve differential equations faster than most people could solve a crossword puzzle. She stared at the seat back in front of her. Her fists were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white, her nails digging crescent moons into her palms. 3 hours. She sat there for 3 hours while the man beside her dismantled her existence with every casually racist sentence. 3 hours of swallowing fire. 3 hours of biting her tongue so hard she could taste copper. 3 hours of the specific, particular agony of being reduced to a demographic in a conversation happening 2 feet from your face. She didn't speak. She didn't turn. She didn't challenge him. Not because she didn't have the words. She had words that could have stripped him to the bone. But she had no power. She was a nobody. A 22-year-old in a middle seat with a borrowed laptop and a dream. If she had spoken up, she would have been the angry one, The difficult one. The one who couldn't take a joke. The one who made things uncomfortable. So she absorbed it. The way she had been taught to absorb it. The way women like her were always expected to absorb it. Quietly, gracefully, without making a scene. When the plane landed in Dallas, she walked to her hotel, rode the elevator to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and cried. Not soft, cinematic tears, ugly, body-shaking sobs that came from a place so deep she didn't even know its name. She wasn't crying from sadness, she was crying from rage. Rage at the man, rage at his friend, rage at the silence of every other passenger who heard and said nothing, and rage at herself for being one of the silent ones. She had promised herself that night sitting on that thin hotel bedspread with her face wet and her chest aching, that she would never be silent again. Not when it mattered, not when the words needed to be said. She would build something so undeniable, so unassailable, that the next time someone tried to reduce her, she wouldn't need to clench her fists and swallow. She would simply speak, and the world would have no choice but to listen. The third memory was different. It wasn't a wound, it was a birth. She was 31, the apartment was in Palo Alto, now a one-bedroom that she rented with money from her first patent license. The desk was second-hand. The chair was a folding metal contraption that left marks on the back of her thighs after long sessions, and the whiteboard on the wall was covered in equations that would have looked like abstract art to anyone who didn't speak the language of cryptographic algorithms. It was 2:17 in the morning. She had been working for 14 straight hours, fueled by black coffee and the particular obsession that strikes when you're close to something, when the solution is hovering just beyond the edge of your vision, flickering like a star you can only see when you're not looking directly at it. And then she saw it. The sequence resolved. The algorithm collapsed into elegance. The encryption key she had been designing, the one that would make existing financial security protocols look like padlocks on a bank vault, assembled itself on the whiteboard in 6 clean lines of logic. She stared at it. Her hand holding the marker trembled. Not from exhaustion, from the sheer electric recognition that she had just created something that would change an industry. She picked up her phone and called her mother. 2:17 a.m. in California, 5:17 a.m. in Oakland, where Diane Blackwell still lived in the apartment on the cracked sidewalk street, still woke up at 5 for her morning shift, still carried herself like a woman who had something to say. Mama Naomi said, her voice cracking for the first time in years. I think I just changed everything. There was a pause, the sound of blankets shifting. Then Diane's voice, sleepy but fierce, carrying the same conviction it had carried when she knelt beside a 9-year-old holding a library book. Baby, you were always going to. Now go change it louder. Prism Forge Technologies was born that night. Within 3 years, it would be valued at $200 million. Within 8, $1 billion. Within 15, $4.2 billion. The encryption algorithm from that Palo Alto apartment now protected the financial data of governments, central banks, and corporations across the globe. And it all started with a woman who refused to accept someone else's ceiling. Now, at 48, sitting in seat 2J of a grounded aircraft, Naomi felt the weight of all those moments pressing against her sternum. Every insult had forged a piece of armor. Every silent flight had built a layer of patience so deep it looked like indifference. Every swallowed response, every locked jaw, every moment she had chosen quiet over confrontation had been deposited into a vault that she carried with her everywhere. And today, for the first time in 26 years, she was making a withdrawal. Not because she had finally found her voice. She had always had her voice. What she had found, what she had spent 26 years building, was the microphone, the platform, the power to make the words matter. She turned from the window. Her face to every observer in the cabin was unchanged, calm, composed, impenetrable. Only her fingers resting on the leather armrest pressed down slightly harder for a single second. Then they released, and the reckoning continued. George Whitfield arrived at 7 minutes past the call. He was sweating. His suit, which had probably looked expensive and crisp when he left his office at Atlantic Crown's JFK corporate suite, was now rumpled from the sprint across the terminal. His tie was slightly askew. A bead of perspiration sat on his upper lip like a punctuation mark on a face arranged in a mask of desperate apology. He was 49 years old, the Senior Vice President of Customer Experience, a title that sounded prestigious until moments like this when customer experience meant standing in front of a woman who had just detonated a $28 million bomb and asking her to please consider not throwing the detonator away. He bypassed the flight attendants without a glance. He bypassed Captain Miller, who stood by the galley partition like a man watching his house burn from across the street. He walked directly to seat 2J and positioned himself in the aisle, his body angled slightly forward in the universal posture of corporate supplication. "Dr. Blackwell," he began, his voice betraying the faintest tremor beneath its professional polish. "I'm George Whitfield, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience for Atlantic Crown Airways. On behalf of the entire airline, our board, our executive team, and every member of our staff, I want to offer our deepest, most sincere apologies for what you have experienced this evening. What happened was unacceptable, it was inexcusable, and it is not representative of who we are." Naomi looked up from the entertainment screen she had been idly scrolling through. Her expression was unreadable the way the surface of deep water is unreadable. You know there's something below, but you can't tell how deep it goes or what's down there. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying the particular courtesy of someone who has already made their decision and is now simply narrating its consequences. "Your airline has already shown me exactly who you are. You are an organization whose first response to racial prejudice is to accommodate it. Your purser asked me to move. Your junior flight attendant suggested moving my belongings while I was distracted. Your captain addressed the situation as a minor issue in his cabin announcement. Every single response from your team at every single level prioritized convenience over conscience. You did not fail in one moment. You failed in a sequence. And a sequence is not an accident. It is a pattern." The word pattern landed with surgical precision. Whitfield's face, already strained, aged 5 years in front of her. "And we will fix it," he said, his voice pitching upward with the urgency of a man trying to bail water from a sinking ship with a teaspoon. "Dr. Blackwell, I have already spoken with our head of training, Darren Caldwell. The purser is being suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. We will be completely rewriting our de-escalation protocols within 48 hours. We are committed to meaningful, lasting change." He paused, searching her face for any crack in the facade, any sign that his words were landing. He found nothing. Her composure was a fortress without doors. "What can we do?" he asked, leaning slightly closer, his voice dropping to the register of bare honesty. "To make this right? To keep your business?" The question hung in the air between them, naked and desperate. It was the question of a man whose career, whose division, whose quarterly targets, all depended on the answer of a woman sitting in a leather seat with her hands folded in her lap. "You can't," Naomi said. 2 words. She said them simply, the way you'd state the time. Whitfield's face crumpled slightly, like a paper bag losing its shape. "Dr. Blackwell, please, we value your partnership enormously. Prism Forge is one of our most important clients. Surely there is something, some gesture, some commitment we can make." "Let me save us both some time," Naomi said, her tone shifting from cold to something closer to tired. The weariness of a woman who had been offered too many gestures in her life and knew exactly how much they were worth. "I know what's coming. You're going to offer me travel credits, lifetime upgrades. Then you'll escalate to a donation, probably to the United Negro College Fund because that's the default corporate playbook. You'll offer to create a scholarship in my name. And if you're really desperate, you'll suggest naming an aircraft after my company." Whitfield's mouth opened slightly. She had just recited his entire playbook in ascending order. Every offer he had been authorized to make during his frantic sprint across the terminal was laid out on the table before he could place a single card. "Let me tell you why none of that works," Naomi continued. "Because this is not about money. It was never about money. If it were about money, I would have taken the $5,000 voucher Darren offered and moved to 1K, and none of us would be having this conversation. This is about what your $5,000 voucher revealed. It revealed that your airline has a price for dignity, and the price you set was $5,000 and a window seat." She shook her head slowly. The price of doing business with Prism Forge Technologies is dignity. It is respect. It is a guarantee that when one of my employees, one of the 400 people whose livelihoods I am responsible for, boards one of your aircraft, they will not be treated as an inconvenience to be relocated. That guarantee was broken tonight. Not by Mrs. Davenport, by you, by your policies, by the culture that trained your staff to move the victim instead of confronting the aggressor. She looked him in the eye. You cannot buy back what you never earned. The partnership is terminated. Whitfield stood in the aisle, his mouth working silently, his hands hanging at his sides with the uselessness of tools designed for a problem that no longer had a mechanical solution. He looked like a man standing on a shore, watching his boat drift away, knowing there was nothing to throw. No rope long enough, no voice loud enough to bring it back. "Please," he said, and the word came out smaller than he intended. There must be something. Naomi considered him for a long moment. She saw the panic in his eyes, the naked corporate terror. She could ask for anything. She could demand he fire the entire flight crew on the spot. She could demand a public apology printed in the Wall Street Journal. She could make him grovel. But this was not about revenge. This was about consequences. And consequences, unlike revenge, required precision. "There is one thing," she said. Whitfield's eyes widened. "Name it." "The truth." He blinked. "I'm sorry, I want the captain to make an announcement to every passenger on this aircraft," Naomi said, her voice as clear as a bell in an empty church. "He will not say this delay is due to operational issues. He will not say it's a manifest discrepancy. He will not use any of the corporate euphemisms your communications team has been drilling into your staff for decades." She leaned forward just slightly enough to close the distance by an inch. "He will tell them the truth. He will say that this flight has been canceled because a passenger engaged in racist abuse of a fellow traveler and in the process exposed a deep-rooted failure in your airline's policies, a failure that has now resulted in the termination of a major corporate partnership. He will tell 312 people exactly why they are not going to London tonight. All of it. The truth. Nothing else." Whitfield looked like a man who had just been asked to swallow a live grenade. That kind of announcement, the PR implications alone, it would be on social media in seconds. It already is, Naomi said, gesturing almost imperceptibly toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. "There is a young woman standing behind that curtain who has been live streaming this entire incident, to at last count, well over 100,000 viewers. Your cabin is already on the internet, George. The truth is already out there. The only question is whether it comes from you with whatever shred of integrity you can still claim, or whether it comes from 100,000 strangers who will tell it their own way." She sat back. "Make the announcement, and I'll know your airline is at least capable of honesty, even if it's not yet capable of decency. Refuse, and I deplane, and you can explain the cancellation however you wish. But we both know how that story ends." Whitfield stood motionless in the aisle. Behind him, Captain Miller watched from the galley partition, his face a mask of professional resignation. In seat 1, A. Harper Fontaine was nodding slowly as if watching a verdict being delivered that she had long ago drafted in her own mind. In 3, J. Jack Medina's camera captured Whitfield's expression the moment a man realized he was choosing between two forms of destruction and trying to determine which one left something standing. In 1, C. Vincent Greer had stopped smirking. His arms were uncrossed, now his champagne untouched. He looked like a man who had just realized the game he thought he understood was being played on a board he couldn't see. In 3, H, Patricia Lowell was staring at her hands. And then, from seat 2K, directly across the narrow aisle from Naomi, a woman stood up. Elena Voss was 42, German-born with sharp cheekbones, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of lean, efficient posture that suggested she viewed excess of any kind, physical, emotional, or verbal, as a form of engineering failure. She was a tech executive, the CTO of a Berlin-based cloud infrastructure firm, and she had been watching the entire scene with the silent, attentive focus of someone cataloging data points for a report she was already writing in her head. She addressed Captain Miller and George Whitfield simultaneously, her accented English precise and unhurried. "Excuse me," she said, adjusting her glasses. "I think there is something you both should know, and I think you should know it before you make any more decisions tonight." Miller and Whitfield turned to her two men drowning who would grasp at any floating object. I sat beside Dr. Blackwell at the Global Cyber Summit in Munich last October. Helena said, her voice carrying the clinical authority of someone presenting findings at a conference. She delivered the keynote address to an audience of 300 CEOs from 42 countries. When she finished, every person in that auditorium stood. 300 chief executive officers gave her a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. I have never seen anything like it in 20 years in this industry. She paused, letting the image settle. Her encryption protocols protect the financial data of 200 million people across 6 continents. Her algorithms are used by central banks, defense ministries, and unless I am very much mistaken, she looked directly at Whitfield, by the payment processing infrastructure that handles your own airline's credit card transactions. Whitfield's face went from pale to gray. The color change was so dramatic it was almost cinematic. He turned to Miller. Miller turned to Darren. Darren looked at the floor. No one spoke. Helena Voss sat back down, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing more. Her work was done. She had delivered the data. What they did with it was their concern. The second tier of the power reveal had landed. The first tier, Naomi's phone call, had been the earthquake. Helena's testimony was the tsunami that followed. First, the ground shifted. Then the wave arrived. And the wave was always worse because by the time you saw it, there was nowhere left to run. Whitfield turned back to Naomi. His last card had been played. His last offer had been rejected. His airline's largest client in North America had just been identified as not merely a customer, but the architect of the infrastructure that kept the airline's own financial systems secure. The implications were staggering. If Prism Forge pulled not just their travel account but their technology contracts, he didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The thought finished itself. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll make the announcement." He turned and walked toward the cockpit. His shoulders were rounded, his steps heavy. His body language, the universal silhouette of defeat. He looked like a man walking to deliver his own eulogy. Captain Miller followed him into the cockpit. The door closed. 3 minutes passed. 3 minutes that felt like 30, during which the cabin existed in a suspended state of collective breath-holding. And then the intercom crackled. Captain Miller's voice came through the speakers, and it was different from every other announcement he had ever made in 25 years of flying. The confident cadence was gone. The professional authority was gone. What remained was something raw, something stripped bare. Something that sounded like a man reading words he wished he didn't have to say. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention please." He cleared his throat. "I have an announcement, and I want to be transparent with you because you deserve the truth. Tonight's Flight 714 to London Heathrow is being cancelled." A wave of groans swept through the aircraft, angry muttering, a few sharp exclamations. "The reason for this cancellation," the captain continued, his voice heavy, "is a discriminatory incident that occurred in the first-class cabin before departure. A passenger refused to be seated next to another passenger because of her race. The handling of this incident by our airline staff revealed a significant and deeply rooted failure in our internal policies and training protocols. Specifically, our initial response was to ask the targeted passenger to relocate rather than to address the passenger who was causing the disturbance." The groans had stopped. The cabin was silent. 312 people were listening. This failure has resulted in the immediate termination of a major corporate partnership that represented one of our airline's most significant client relationships. As a consequence of this termination and the broader issues it has exposed, we have made the decision to ground this aircraft pending a full internal review. He paused. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost personal. "All passengers will need to deplane and proceed to the gate agents for rebooking assistance. On behalf of Atlantic Crown Airways, I am profoundly sorry. Not just for the delay and inconvenience, but for the failure that caused it. We will do better. We must do better." The intercom clicked off. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The cabin existed in a vacuum. Then the eruption began. It was a cacophony of reactions, a human symphony of anger, disbelief, frustration, and threading through it all, like a silver vein in dark rock, something else. Scattered applause. Harper Fontaine clapped. Slowly, deliberately, the way a judge acknowledges a particularly well-argued closing statement. Her husband, Arthur, joined her. In 4B, Marco Delgado nodded once, the curt, decisive nod of a man who recognized when the right call had finally been made. Late, but made. Jack Medina lowered his phone for the first time since the incident began and whispered into the lens. That is how you force a reckoning. Remember this flight. Remember this number. 714. Passengers around the cabin were pulling out their phones, texting, posting, calling. The announcement, verbatim, would be on Twitter within 60 seconds, on Reddit within 90, on CNN within 5 minutes. But Naomi was already standing. She gathered her things with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had a car waiting and a competitor airline to catch. Tablet into her leather bag, coat folded over her arm, bag lifted from the overhead compartment with a single, smooth motion. As she stepped into the aisle, she paused beside Darren Caldwell, who was standing near the galley curtain, his face a study in devastation. His headset was off, hanging around his neck. His hands were clasped in front of him. He looked diminished, as if the events of the past hour had physically compressed him. Naomi stopped. She looked at him, and her expression was not contempt. It was not triumph. It was something that a less perceptive person might have mistaken for pity, but was actually something rarer. It was recognition. "You're not a bad person, Darren," she said, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "I don't believe you acted out of malice tonight. I believe you acted out of training, out of instinct, out of 20 years of being rewarded for making problems disappear quietly." She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "But I need you to understand something. The instinct to protect the schedule instead of the passenger, to move the victim instead of confronting the aggressor. That instinct is not neutral. It is a choice. It may feel like efficiency. It may feel like pragmatism. But it is a choice, and it has consequences. Not just for the person you asked to move, for every person who looks like me who will ever board one of your flights and wonder in the back of their mind whether they're welcome here." Darren's eyes were glassy. His throat moved as he swallowed. He opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? She hadn't attacked him. She hadn't insulted him. She had done something far more unsettling. She had seen him clearly, and the portrait she drew was accurate enough to hurt. "I'm sorry," he managed the words coming out cracked and insufficient. "I'm truly sorry." Naomi nodded once. "Then, make sure it mattered." She turned and walked down the aisle of first class, past the seats, past the overhead compartments, past the silent witnesses who watched her go with expressions ranging from guilt to awe, to the uncomfortable self-examination of people who were asking themselves, for perhaps the first time, whether they would have spoken up or stayed silent. Vincent Greer in 1C did not look at her as she passed. He was staring at the back of the seat in front of him with the fixed gaze of a man trying very hard not to think about something. Patricia Lowell in 3H had her face turned toward the window. Harper Fontaine caught Naomi's eye as she passed row 1. The retired judge gave her a single, slow nod. It was a nod between equals, between women who understood what it meant to stand alone in a room full of people who wished you'd sit down. Marco Delgado extended his hand as she passed row 4. Naomi shook it without breaking stride. "Well played," he said simply. "It wasn't a game," she replied. "I know," he said. "That's why it worked." Jack Medina's camera followed her all the way to the cabin door. His final shot was of her silhouette, framed in the doorway, the jetway lights behind her, her posture straight, her stride steady. She didn't look back. She didn't pause for effect. She simply walked through the door and was gone. Behind her, Claudia Moran rose from seat 8D in business class, gathered her own bag, and fell into step 3 paces behind Naomi as they walked up the jetway. She never identified herself to anyone on the aircraft. She didn't need to. In her tablet case was a file containing 37 minutes of time-stamped documentation, direct quotes, names, badge numbers, and procedural violations catalogued with the meticulous precision of a woman who had spent 15 years ensuring that Prism Forge Technologies never lost a legal battle. They hadn't spoken. They didn't need to. The system was working. And somewhere in Brooklyn, Devin Archer pressed send on a media statement that had been drafted, reviewed, and approved by Prism Forge's crisis team before Naomi's plane had even completed its announcement. The statement was 4 paragraphs long. It was factual. It was devastating. And its final line read, "The price of partnership with Prism Forge Technologies is dignity. Atlantic Crown Airways failed to pay." On Sophia Reyes's Instagram Live, the viewer count had reached 218,000. She was standing at the gate now watching passengers stream off the aircraft, faces twisted with frustration, confusion, and the dawning awareness that they had just been part of something that would be talked about for a very long time. Sophia looked into her camera one last time. "I came to this airport to catch a flight," she said quietly. "Instead, I watched a woman teach an entire airline what respect is worth. $28 million. That's what respect is worth. Remember that." She ended the stream. By morning, it would have 4.7 million views. If you were one of those 312 passengers, your London trip canceled, your plans ruined, would you blame Naomi? Or would you blame Caroline and the airline that made it all possible? Drop your answer in the comments. Because the karma is just getting started. The Customer Resolution Office near Gate B24 was a small, windowless room with fluorescent lighting that turned everyone's skin the color of old cheese. It was designed for minor complaints, lost luggage, missed connections, the occasional food allergy dispute. It was not designed for what was happening inside it now. Caroline Davenport sat in a plastic chair, her Louis Vuitton bag at her feet, her cashmere wrap still draped over her shoulders, but looking somehow diminished, as if the fabric itself had absorbed the humiliation. Mark sat 2 chairs away from her, not beside her, away. The distance was small, a few feet of industrial carpet, but it spoke volumes. For the first hour, Caroline had been a hurricane. She had demanded to speak to George Whitfield by name. She had threatened to call her attorney, her congressman, and the editor of the New York Post. She had waved her diamond medallion card at 3 separate airline employees as if it were a diplomatic passport, convinced that the magic talisman of her loyalty would eventually find someone susceptible to its spell. But the airline staff who cycled through the room were immovable. Their faces were grim. Their mouths were set in the thin professional lines of people who had received very specific instructions from very senior leadership. The Davenports were not to be accommodated. They were not to be rebooked. They were to be processed. Caroline's fury slowly curdled into something else. The righteous indignation that had sustained her in the first-class cabin was collapsing, giving way to a gnawing, frantic anxiety as the reality of her situation began to seep through the cracks in her armor. The meeting. The Pemberton Group. The Canary Wharf deal. It was the culmination of 2 years of work for Mark's family company, Davenport and Associates Realty. A landmark project to develop a luxury, mixed-use complex in London's financial district. $40 million. International expansion. Legacy. And Caroline was supposed to be the face of it, hosting the celebratory dinner, charming the investors, performing the role she had spent a lifetime perfecting. The role of a woman who belonged in important rooms. The meeting was at 10 a.m. London time. It was now nearly 10 p.m. in New York. There were no flights that would get her there. "Mark, do something," she hissed, her voice a ragged whisper stripped of its earlier theatrics. "Call someone. Call your father. Call our lawyer. Call the airline's board if you have to." Mark, who had been staring at the scuffed floor tiles for the better part of an hour, looked up. And what Caroline saw in his face made her breath catch. It wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It was anger. Cold, quiet, deeply buried anger that had been accumulating for years, decades beneath layers of deference and silence and the careful management of his wife's moods. "No, Caroline," he said, his voice quiet but as firm as she had ever heard it. "I'm not calling anyone." "What do you mean you're not?" I'm not calling anyone." He repeated, each word laid down like a brick in a wall. "Because there is no one to call. You did this. Not the airline, not that woman, you. with your snobbery, your prejudice, your pathological need to feel superior to everyone around you. How dare you? She gasped, the words automatic, reflexive, the defense mechanism of a woman who had never been spoken to like this by the one person who was never supposed to push back. I dare, Mark said, and something shifted behind his eyes, something that had been locked away for a very long time. Because I have been swallowing your poison for 30 years, and tonight I watched it destroy everything we have. You couldn't bear the thought of sitting next to a successful black woman, because in your tiny, brittle world, that is not how the hierarchy is supposed to work. She was supposed to be beneath you. She was supposed to be nobody. And when she wasn't, when she refused to play the role you assigned her, you lost your mind. Caroline's mouth opened. No sound came out. Well, congratulations, Caroline. You proved you were superior. Look where it got us. Before she could respond, her phone began to buzz. Not once, continuously. A cascade of notifications that sounded like a flock of panicked birds. A text from a friend in Greenwich, Caroline. Are you seeing this? Turn on the news, now. She fumbled with her phone, her hands trembling in a way she couldn't control. She opened a news app. The headline filled her screen. JFK flight canceled. 312 stranded after CEO terminates $28 million airline contract over racist incident. Her blood turned to ice. She clicked the link. The story was everywhere. It had metastasized across the internet with the speed of a virus in a closed system. Tweets and posts from passengers who had been on the plane quoted the captain's announcement verbatim. They described the blonde woman in first class who had started it all. They posted screenshots from Sophia Reyes's live stream. They used words like disgusting and appalling and this is what privilege looks like. And then she saw it. A photo, grainy, taken from a phone shot from the angle of seat 3J. It showed her standing in the aisle, arms crossed, face contorted in a sneer, arguing with the flight crew. Behind her, Mark's mortified face. Across the aisle, the composed profile of Dr. Naomi Blackwell, sitting in her seat, reading her tablet. The photo was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Reddit. Her face, her expensive scarf, her expression of entitled contempt frozen in pixels and distributed to millions. Within minutes, the internet's forensic machinery went to work. Her name, Caroline Davenport, was identified and trending. Then came her husband's company, Davenport and Associates Realty. Then her country club. Then the charity board she chaired. Then her address. Then her stylist's Instagram, which she had tagged in a photo that morning, captioned, "Airport Ready," with 3 champagne emojis. Her world, so carefully curated, so meticulously maintained, was being dismantled, post by post, comment by comment, share by share. The hashtag FlightKaren714 was the #1 trending topic in the United States. The door to the resolution office opened. A different airline representative entered. This one was not flustered or apologetic. She was composed, official, carrying a folder that she held the way a process server holds a subpoena. "Mr. and Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "This is a formal notice from Atlantic Crown Airways. Due to the events on board Flight 714, you have both been permanently banned from flying with Atlantic Crown and all partner airlines within our alliance network. Your Diamond Medallion status has been revoked, and the corporate travel account associated with Davenport and Associates Realty has been flagged for immediate suspension and pending termination." She placed the letter on the table between them. "You can't do that," Mark said, his voice hollow. "We've been flying with this airline for 25 years. "The decision is final," the representative said. "You will need to make your own arrangements for onward travel. Security will escort you to the terminal exit." Caroline stared at the letter. The words blurred. The airline's letterhead, which she had seen on countless upgrade confirmations and lounge invitations, now carried a sentence of exile. Permanent ban. Revoked. Suspended. Terminated. She looked up at Mark. Mark looked away. As they were led through the terminal, past the crowds of displaced passengers from Flight 714 who were clustered around gate counters demanding answers, Caroline felt the weight of recognition. People were pointing. They were holding up their phones. They were whispering. They had seen the photo. They knew her face. She was the woman who canceled the flight, the woman who ruined everyone's night, the woman who chose her prejudice over 312 strangers' plans. She kept her eyes forward, but she could feel them, all of them, every glance, every whisper, every pointed phone. It was the specific, excruciating torment of public disgrace, the experience of watching your own reflection in the eyes of strangers and seeing nothing but contempt. 8 hours later, and 4,000 miles away, the sun was rising over London. Sir Alastair Pemberton, 64, the CEO of the Pemberton Group, saw the news on Sky News while stirring his morning tea in his Mayfair townhouse. He set down the spoon. He read the captain's reported announcement. He saw the photo of Caroline Davenport, and then he saw the name of the company at the center of the firestorm. Davenport and Associates Realty, his investment partners, his dinner companions for that evening, the people with whom he was supposed to be closing a £40 million deal for a luxury mixed-use development in Canary Wharf. By 9:05 a.m. London time, a crisp, formal email was sent from Pemberton Group's general counsel to Davenport & Associates' head office in Connecticut. It was one paragraph long. It stated that due to a fundamental misalignment of corporate and social values, the Pemberton Group was withdrawing from the Canary Wharf project effective immediately. All negotiations were terminated. All preliminary agreements were void. The $40 million deal, the one Caroline had cited as her justification for her behavior, the one she had wielded like a weapon to demand special treatment, was dead. It had been killed not in a boardroom, but by 9 words spoken in an airplane aisle 4,000 miles away. The consequences continued to cascade with the merciless efficiency of gravity. The charity board Caroline chaired, the Davenport Arts Foundation, held an emergency Zoom meeting at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The vote to remove her was unanimous. By 11:30, her name and photo had been scrubbed from the foundation's website. The section that had previously read, "Under the visionary leadership of Caroline Davenport," now read, "Under new leadership, the foundation remains committed to inclusive excellence in the arts." Her country club, the Greenfield Club in Greenwich, issued a quiet letter that afternoon. It reluctantly accepted the resignation of Mrs. Caroline Davenport, which was the polished corporate fiction for being expelled. The letter cited conduct inconsistent with the values of our membership community. 3 board members later admitted privately that the decision had been made before the letter was drafted. They were simply waiting for a paragraph that sounded genteel enough. Robert Davenport Sr., 82 years old, the man who had built Davenport & Associates from a one-man office into a respected regional real estate firm, was forced to record a video statement from his study in Westport. His hands shook as he read from the prepared text, his voice cracking at the edges. The statement announced that Caroline held no official position at the company, that her views were abhorrent and categorically rejected, and that Mark Davenport was taking an indefinite leave of absence while the firm conducted an internal review. When the camera stopped recording, Robert Davenport Sr. sat in his leather chair and stared at the family portrait on his desk, the one taken at Mark and Caroline's wedding 28 years ago. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned it face down. In less than 24 hours, Caroline Davenport had lost her reputation, her social standing, her husband's position in his own family's company, and the biggest business deal of their lives. She had become radioactive in the world she had spent 5 decades building and maintaining, a world of charity luncheons and club memberships and curated dinner parties, and the careful, constant performance of belonging to the right circles. She sat in the silence of her Greenwich home. The television was off. The phone was off. The house, with its vaulted ceilings and imported marble and rooms designed for entertaining guests who would never come again, was enormous around her. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of all the things she had said. Full of all the things she couldn't unsay. The irony was a knife with a slow blade. She had refused to sit next to Dr. Naomi Blackwell because she saw her as beneath her, a disruption to the natural order of a world that Caroline believed she sat at the top of. Yet it was Naomi who was at that very moment in London, chairing a meeting on quantum encryption in a glass-walled office overlooking the Thames. Her authority undiminished, her empire intact, her power amplified by the very incident that had destroyed Caroline's world. And it was Caroline who was grounded, isolated, stripped of the status she had clung to like a life raft in a sea of her own making. She had tried to put a black woman in her place, and in doing so, the world had put Caroline firmly, irreversibly, in hers. Naomi arrived in London on a United Airlines flight out of Washington Dulles that Liam's team had booked within 40 minutes of her deplaning at JFK. She slept 5 hours deep and dreamless, and woke as the plane descended through a soft layer of English clouds into a pale gray morning. Her car was waiting at Heathrow. Her suite at the Savoy was ready, and her 2 p.m. meeting with Prism Forge's London office was still firmly on the schedule. For her, the incident was concluded. The principle had been asserted. The consequences had been delivered. She had not canceled that flight out of ego or a desire for revenge. She had canceled it because a line had been crossed, and lines that are crossed without consequence are lines that cease to exist. She was reviewing the final slides for her meeting when Liam burst into her London office, his tie loosened, his tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. "They're not giving up," he said, foregoing any greeting. Atlantic Crown. "George Whitfield has emailed me 4 times since midnight. They're offering an 8-figure donation to UNCF in your name. A Dr. Naomi Blackwell scholarship for aspiring female engineers. And this is the best part. They want to christen the next A350 in their fleet, the Spirit of Prism." Naomi set down her pen. A short, sharp laugh escaped her. Not triumphant, but genuinely disbelieving. "The Spirit of Prism," she repeated, named after a company whose founder they tried to move to the back of the plane 12 hours ago. The audacity is almost architectural. She turned to face him directly. "Tell Mr. Whitfield that a company's values are not a line item in a crisis management budget. They cannot purchase their way back into our good graces because this was never about money. It was about respect. They failed that test. The partnership remains terminated." Liam nodded, typing the response. Then he paused, his expression shifting. "There's one more thing," he said, carefully. "The reaction online. For every 10 people calling you a hero, there's one calling you an elitist, saying you used your power to punish 300 innocent people just to make a point, that you could have moved seats and filed a complaint later, that 2 wrongs don't make a right." Naomi was quiet for a moment. She turned toward the window, looking out at London, sprawling beneath the glass, the river curving the rooftops layered with centuries. "They misunderstand power," she said finally, her voice soft but resonant. "They see it as a weapon. I see it as a responsibility. I see it as a tool, and tools are measured by what they build, not by who they frighten." She turned back to him. "Did I punish 300 people? No. The moment Mrs. Davenport refused to sit, she held that flight hostage with her bigotry. The moment the crew offered to move me, they became her accomplices. The moment the captain was called, the schedule was already in jeopardy. I didn't create the crisis, I diagnosed it. And the inconvenience those passengers suffered was not a symptom of my response. It was a symptom of a disease that existed long before I boarded that plane." She walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like against the city below. "I remember being 22, Liam. A coach seat to Dallas, middle row. A man beside me spent 3 hours telling his friend that people like me were affirmative action hires who lowered the bar for everyone. I sat there with my fists clenched so tight my knuckles were white. 3 hours. I said nothing. I had no power. I just absorbed it. And afterward, in a hotel room in Texas, I cried. Not from sadness, from the rage of my own silence." She touched the cool glass of the window. "I am not 22 anymore. I am not powerless. And the grace my critics want, the grace of moving seats, of filing a quiet complaint that would end up in a forgotten drawer, that is not grace. That is the silence I was forced into for 26 years. It is the silence that women like me are expected to maintain so that everyone else can be comfortable. And I will not do it. Not anymore." She straightened and turned to face him fully. This was for that 22-year-old version of myself. For every quiet, brilliant person at my company who has ever been made to feel small on an airplane or in a boardroom or in a classroom. When Prism Forge signs a contract with a vendor, we are entrusting them with our people. Atlantic Crown proved they were not worthy of that trust. So I took our people back. That wasn't a tantrum, Liam. It was an extraction. Liam held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Understood. I'll send the final response. Do that, she said. And Liam closed the door on the way out. I have a meeting to prepare for. He left. The office was quiet. London hummed beyond the glass. That evening, alone in her hotel suite at the Savoy, Naomi sat in the window seat overlooking the Thames as the city turned golden beneath the setting sun. Her meeting had gone well. The quantum encryption project was on track. The London team was sharp and hungry and ready. The work continued. It always continued. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother in Oakland. Saw the news, baby. Your father would have been so proud. So am I. Naomi stared at the message. She read it twice, 3 times, and for the first time in 48 hours, the armor cracked. Just slightly, just enough. Her eyes stung, her throat tightened. She blinked, and a single tear traced a line down her cheek before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. She typed back. I finally spoke up, Mama. For every flight, I stayed silent. 3 dots appeared, then her mother's reply. 3 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. That's my girl. Naomi set the phone down on the windowsill and looked out at London glowing beneath her. The Thames was a ribbon of bronze. The dome of St. Paul's caught the last light. Somewhere below, millions of people were living their lives, carrying their own silences, choosing their own battles, deciding every day whether to absorb or to speak. She thought of every woman who had ever swallowed her voice on a plane, in a bank, in a boardroom, in a classroom. Every woman who was told to be realistic about her ceiling. Every person who was asked to move so that someone else's prejudice could sit more comfortably. She didn't cancel that flight for herself. She canceled it for all of them. For the 9-year-old in Oakland whose teacher told her to think small. For the 22-year-old in a middle seat who cried alone in a Dallas hotel room. For every brilliant, quiet person who ever absorbed someone else's cruelty and called it keeping the peace. The story of Flight 714 would fade from the headlines. The hashtags would cool. The think pieces would be written and forgotten. But the principle would remain etched into the memory of an industry whispered in training rooms and boardrooms and break rooms, remembered every time someone in a position of power had to choose between convenience and conscience, between protecting the schedule and protecting the person. The price of dignity was $28 million and a canceled flight, and Dr. Naomi Blackwell would authorize it again tomorrow without a moment's hesitation, because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to move and let the world rearrange itself around her. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. What part stood out to you the most? If you believe that actions should always have consequences, drop the word dignity in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Turn on that notification bell so you're the first to know when a new video drops. We have incredible stories coming your way. Stories of justice, karma, and the unstoppable power of standing your ground with grace. Until next time, stay kind, stay just, and never let anyone tell you where you belong. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, businesses, and events are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.